season together. The first week together, we talked about the promised land. The second week, we talked about covenant. The third week, we talked about suffering. And last week, for those of you who came to the 5 p.m. service, we talked about grace. I'm sure the rest of you will check out that sermon online, because that's what you like to do in your free time. Maybe we have that in common. And so the way this sermon series has been working is we look at an Old Testament text from the lectionary, one of the 2 Old Testament texts, and we look at the gospel lesson, and we figure out how they speak into each other, what they have in common, and from there we have a theme. In fact, the song that Kirsten just sang connected the 2 pretty well. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. It's often that in the African American spirituals, you've got these connections that are made between the Exodus tradition, between the Old Testament, and between our gospel lessons. And so I could have just done a sermon on that spiritual, and I would love to sometime, but it didn't really fit with our sermon series. So I went with a theme, like we've been doing, we're connecting both of these texts with a theme, and our theme this week is change, which is good because I rewrote the beginning of this sermon like 3 times. The last one was at like 3 a.m. this morning, or 2 a.m., whatever time it was on your clock at that time, when you probably also weren't sleeping, tossing and turning. So this is what I got for our intro to this sermon today. We're going to talk about change, and my original sermon had all these cutesy stories about how I always thought I was really open to change, and I was that kind of person, and how slowly and surely over time I've learned that I'm not. And so I'd like to, instead of sharing those stories, just start there. I don't like change. I don't. I'm a very progressive Christian, right? And, there's some ways that I feel like I'm part of a movement. But when it comes to my core being, most of the change that I want is to have other people change to my core being, right? I just want them to be more like me. I don't know how helpful that is either, but that's the truth. I don't really want to budge often, and that's true for my life. It's true for my ministry. It's true for my world and with my family. I think back to the very first intro to pastoral care class I had to take. The very first thing our professor made us read was an old essay on the inability for the human being to change. And the essay went into these long, drawn-out reasons in psychology why people think that they're ready and willing to change, but how most people actually never do. There might be 1 to 3 times in your life where you make a really big change and things turn around. But it's rare. It's rare in my world. In fact, there's things that I lift up as more important than change. And for my example of this, I took this from a young pastor named Brent, who I met at a conference in LA back in January. And he had some really great things to say about change and reluctance for change. And he talked about the 2 things that we lift up more, that we consider better than change, or that we put more of our heart into. And these things are repetition and consistency. We like consistency and we like the same results. Like, we want it and we want it always there. If it was there once, we want it there again. And he used a couple great examples of based around food. And this is so true. So Brent shared that the first time he ever had a tomato was when he was 26 years old. He was at a farmer's market with his wife, and his wife pointed to this fruit and said, "Hey, let's get some of these." And he pretended like he knew what it was. He was like, "Yeah, that looks amazing." And she, and eventually she kind of figured it out and was like, "Have you never had a tomato?" And he was like, "That's a tomato?" Because what he was looking at was purple, not red. And it was all odd-shaped. It wasn't round. And she said, "Yeah, honey, that's an heirloom tomato. That's what they used to look like. That's what tomatoes looked like." And he tried it, and he said it was the most delicious piece of fruit he had ever eaten. See, Brent was used to going to the grocery store, right? Where there's this like repeatability and this consistency where every day he goes, no matter what, there's a nice red round tomato available that 9 months out of the year probably tastes like dirt, right? But it's there. And that feeling of it being there every time he walks in gives him comfort. It gives me comfort. Could you imagine going into your grocery store and having food that was only in season and grown within 300 miles of St. Louis available? Don't get me wrong, people are doing amazing things with greenhouses. You would be surprised at the amount of variety would be available. But the bareness of the shelves would make me concerned because it's not the same thing that was there last week, and I need to know that like things are going to be the way that they were before, right? But that's not how things work. This change stuff is inevitable, whether we like it or not. And the idea of this like repetition and consistency, these are our things. These are the ways of the world, and not necessarily the way of God. In fact, here's another clever thing that pastors talk about all the time. What are the 8 words of a dying church? Have you guys ever heard this? The 8 words of a dying church. We have never done it that way before. Church consultants tell this stuff to pastors when they go to conferences to like reassure them that like whatever you're doing and upsetting people by, don't forget, we have never done it that way before. The 8 words of a dying church. You'll be okay. Don't lose too much sleep. I don't like change. When I got hired here at MUMC, I was on this like high horse of like, listen, I've got tattoos and I'm not going to cover them, okay? And like, if that means that this church isn't for me, then maybe you shouldn't hire me. As if I wasn't desperate for work and as if I didn't want to be here and I wasn't super excited about starting a young adult ministry. But that's true. Like I had these things, right? I have these things that I don't want to budge on all the time. And I don't think I'm alone. Maybe I'm alone, but I don't think I'm alone in that. Or another one, when I was in 3rd grade, my mother tried to put an angel on top of the Christmas tree instead of the star. I lost it. I was like, what are you doing? It's not Christmas. It's not Christmas without the star on top of the tree. If Jesus himself came in and tried to put an angel on top of my Christmas tree, I'd be like, yeah, it just doesn't feel right. You know what I mean, Jesus? It just doesn't sit right with me. I am not good with change. Change is hard, but change is the way of God. Change is the way of God. Our Old Testament text that comes from Isaiah was written during a very difficult time in Israel's history. The nations of Israel had fallen to the Babylonian Empire. They had been at war and then they were exiled, a good number of them at least, to Babylon. And they're on the verge of maybe having the opportunity to be released and to go back home. And this text is a word of hope. It's about this planned restoration that God has for the whole community. That God has a plan to restore the community and the land and all of creation back to God. And it starts off with this retelling or like this recalling of the memory of Egypt and how God freed God's people from Egypt. You know, it's really the Pharaoh's army got drowned. It talks about how they laid down in the sea and they were unable to move. So it recalls this story from Egypt. It says, remember how God freed you? And then the very next part of the text says, do not remember the former things or consider things of old. I'm about to do a new thing. And it says, I will make a way. It said that at the beginning and in the middle there. I will make a way. So this is super confusing because it just told us the past, like it brings up this memory of the past in Egypt, and then the text says, but do not remember former things. That doesn't make sense, right? Like you ask me to remember and then not to remember. But this is This is doing something different here. It's about us holding on to the memory of the hope and the knowledge that God is a God of liberation, that God did liberate us. And that is the essence of God, and you are not to forget that part. God is doing something. God is making a way. God is making a way in our lives and in our world. And this time, unlike the escape from Egypt, which was filled with like drought and hunger and doubts and death, God is going to make a way that's going to provide abundant water and abundant food and certainty and life. God says, trust me. Listen, I know you don't like change, but I'm doing something here. Remember Egypt? I got you out of Egypt, didn't I? I'm continuing to make it better. So you got to let Egypt go. I know the good old times matter. I know that change is hard and that it can be deeply uncomfortable, but I'm doing a new thing. God is the God of the past for sure, but God is the God of the future as well. And God is always working in the present. The text says twice that God is making a way. Even when it recalled the story from Egypt, it said God is making a way. Not God made a way. Not God has plans to make a way. But right now, God is making a way. And God's liberation, it goes beyond just God's people. I mean, this text talks about the restoration of creation, even to the jackals and the ostriches. These animals were considered wild animals, and they were considered difficult. Difficult to tame, difficult to control, difficult to know where they were. What does it mean that the liberating love of God, that the liberating grace of God will extend even to those that we find difficult? Even to the parts of our lives, or the parts of our church life, or the parts of our relationships that we find difficult. What does that mean? That this is the way that God is making. Change is hard, but change is necessary, right? If God's plan is restoration for all of the people and for all of creation, then we will be participating in a changing world and a changing church at all times. No matter how frightening that is, at least we have each other. So I'm going to move to our New Testament text, which I could have spent hours on, but I'm not going to. Our New Testament text for today is one of my absolute favorite. So Mary is anointing Jesus' feet. Mary knows that change is coming. She sees it, and she knows exactly why it's coming. See, a few days before this story, Jesus had raised Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus from the dead. And because of Jewish burial and mourning customs, a very large number of people saw it. The amount of people and the kind of people that didn't need to be seeing this. That action, Jesus rising Lazarus from the dead, that healing was the tipping point. In healing Lazarus, Jesus' fate on the cross was sealed. And Mary knew it. But there was something else she understood. See, Lazarus, rose from the dead, but Lazarus was part of that restoration so clearly. Lazarus was restored to his community. Lazarus was restored to his family. Lazarus was restored to the world. This is that act that God is doing. And Mary saw it. She witnessed it with her own eyes. And she knew that the restoration was coming and that this is what God was all about and that this is what Jesus was all about. She understood that this work of restoration was the very work of God, but this work would bring about some type of change. One that would devastate her and would be difficult to live with. She understood that in the act of restoring her brother, Jesus' life would be taken Mary anoints Jesus with this expensive nard perfume, burial perfume. I try to imagine the contrast between the smell of her brother's corpse like a week before versus the smell of this fragrant perfume filling the whole house. It's such an expression of that restoration. It's such an expression of life and of what God's plans are. Mary understands the sacrifice that Jesus is making for the sake of restoration, for the sake of change. God's way is the way of restoration, where God is making a new thing. God is making a new way out of the same old people, out of the same old communities, out of the same old churches. I know what it's like to want to hold on to the past in our lives and ministry, in our homes and our church. And I know that we need to take time to mourn our past, and that that's healthy. But I also know that God is doing something amazing in the midst of our discomfort. The thing about tomatoes is when they go out of season, it doesn't mean the tomato failed, right? Tomatoes don't fail because they go out of season. They just go out of season sometimes. It's the same with other things in our life and in our ministries. There's a class that was started. Seeds were planted. The soil was tended to. The plant grew and it bore fruit. And then it didn't. And that's okay. That's absolutely beautiful. It lived in its season and it did what it was supposed to do. And now it's not in season anymore, and that's great. That's okay, because something else will be coming into season. The only consistency that we need, the only repetition that we need is the grace of God, the assurance of the constant grace of God that will be with all things in all seasons. Mary, don't you weep. Pharaoh's army got drowned. God knows what God's doing. Amen.